This is Award 7. I'm Rob Lucuria. I'm joined today by production designer Alex DiGerlando. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, I want to talk about how you chose to build the restaurant rather than shoot it in a real location in Black Rabbit. Because even with 279 Water Street, as in it was inspiration, but you could have just gone the easy route. You didn't do that. You decided to make it harder for yourself. But talk us through that whole process.
Well, you could argue that actually shooting it on location would have made it harder for ourselves because just you know when it's night when a scene takes place at night, you have to shoot at night, and you have to fit into impossible spaces. Also, we fell in love with 279 Water Street, but the inside of it is derelict, basically. So, I mean, you see it in the show in episode 2 in the flashback when Vince shows Jake and kind of explains his vision for the restaurant. So that's what the place actually looks like today. We, our version of the interior of the restaurant, we cheated. We made it a little bit bigger than it actually was. It's two buildings. It's a wooden building on the corner and then a brick building next to it. Those two buildings together comprise of 279 Water Street. The wooden building is uh, it predates the Brooklyn Bridge by almost a century. It's maybe, if not it's one of the oldest still
Wow.
standing wood buildings in New York. Um, and it has this amazing history. And a lot of that history was sort of baked into, once we found the place and we showed it to Zach and Kate, who wrote the show, they started pulling details that we learned from Ross Morgan, who owns the space, started kind of building those ideas, or that those pieces of history into the mythology of the restaurant. And we tried to sort of reflect all of that in our design. So, and some of that was like, there's pictures of the actual, but there's an etching that Ross had of the Brooklyn Bridge being built, and you can see the Black Rabbit in that etching. So we
Wow.
we hung that in our set, and we have a photo hanging of Gallus Maggs, who's known as the first female bouncer. She looks like this sort of like cowboy figure, and because the bar was known to be kind of a hangout for unsavory sorts like pirates and that kind. And there's stories of fights breaking out where ears are ripped off and then kept in the pickle jar on the counter of the bar and things. So all that, and a brothel being upstairs. So all of those kind of things kind of found their way into the DNA of the space. And so walking around it was the River Cafe until I forget what hurricane it was. Either Hurricane Ida or Hurricane Irene. I forget. But anyway, it was kind of decimated during the hurricane, and it's sort of sat empty ever since. And there's just all sorts of beautiful decay in that space. Another reason why it would have been impossible to shoot like the whole show in there is just it would be a health concern. Yeah,
That's right.
we had to abate the areas that we were going to be in, and then sort of tape off everything else. But
Mm.
the details of like some of the crumbling wallpaper, the plaster with the lath showing through the brick that had been kind of busted through and the jagged edge of that, all, and even things that were intact, like the it's beautiful carved wood balustrade for the staircase, and the pebbled tin that lined the walls in certain areas. All of those things are things that I just like fell in love with, and I was like, well,
Mhm.
it would be a crime to sort of eradicate all of that from the space. So we actually replicated a lot of that stuff, and so you see it in its natural form in that flashback scene, but then you see recreations of that in the different spaces. And then the other reason to build is, I had this idea. I mean, logistically is the huge reason to build, but from a design perspective, you just have that much more control. You can make it what you want to be, or what you want it to be. And um,
Yeah.
I always had this idea that the show is about these two brothers, right? And they're both troubled in their own way, but one is kind of like his life is in shambles, and the other one kind of is living on the precipice, but he definitely presents like he's
Hmm.
doing better than he is. And so anywhere you look in that restaurant, you're seeing, the two sides of that relationship. You're seeing the the crumbling plaster, and then you're seeing, a high-end imported wallpaper. And those two walls like intersect each other kind of anywhere you look. So that was something that I really wanted to convey and infuse throughout that whole set, all three floors of it.
We have so much to unpack with that. So let's do a bit more of a deep dive in some of the things that you've just described. So fascinating because it obviously building a space from scratch lets you control the storytelling or control at least parts of how the story is going to be told. What a gift for a production designer, right? That must have been so exciting for you. Um, and really what I want to delve into is um, you know, 27 Wall Street obviously has all these scars that you mentioned. So fascinating, by the way. They should do a documentary about the making of
Yeah.
the Black Rabbit, or maybe there is
Yeah.
one, but I'd love to see it. How do you translate all that history? Like, give us more examples about the textures and the details that we probably didn't consciously notice, but on a rewatch, we probably will see it there because it's staring at us in the face, but it's there to kind of subliminally give us messages about character and about plot, isn't it?
Yeah, well, like a lot of what I just kind of mentioned is sort of everywhere that you see, and also there's a lot of there's a big element of this was something that was talked about with the DPs, when we're figuring out how the show would be shot, that there's always something in between the lens and the action, right? So whether that's like, in the foreground, you see some of the cracked brick, or you're shooting through from behind a bar through a window, because as I mentioned before, right, this is actually one building that was at one time two separate buildings.
Mm.
Um, when you walk up that staircase to the second floor, I don't know if you remember, but there are exterior windows there. So
Yeah.
what we did was we made it as if the brick wall that was put up to separate the two spaces had been torn down to reveal the windows that were bricked over when the taller the newer structure went up. So by removing that, you're looking, you can be in one room that's in what we call the brick building, and you're seeing through a hallway, through a like an exterior window jam into the next space over. And
God.
uh, part of that is just because it's got visual interest, but part of that is also like to create sort of like a feeling of coziness and sort of like ingenuity. Like, these brothers are there's they have scrappy roots, and they really kind of like built something from nothing. And I like the idea of seeing the work, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
so whereas building that set from, like, if we had didn't have if we hadn't discovered 279 Water Street and just built something from scratch. I mean, we looked at a lot of references that found their way into the look of the show, like, famous restaurants in New York City, but also, a lot of the classic gastropubs in England and in the English
Mhm.
countryside and things like that. And then also looking at
Mhm.
like Keith Richards' house and uh, Jimmy Page's house and things like that. All of that stuff was sort of baked into the original concept. But when we found 279 Water, that like really unlocked a lot of stuff. And I think that really added a layer of authenticity because we could pull these details from the actual space, and it wasn't just like purely born out of our imagination.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow. Can you talk us through just maybe a bit more specifically the techniques or tricks that you rely on to create this sense of history, like especially under pressure of time and budget? But things have been made to look older than they actually are, obviously. What do you actually have to physically do with you and your team to make that happen so that it looks so antique, but you just made it, 2 weeks ago?
it's a good question, and it's complicated because, in the past, in some cases, like, on a movie like Beast of the Southern Wild, like every piece of lumber that we used on that was reclaimed. So each piece of wood had a history to it already. So a lot of the patina was kind of built in.
Right.
Um, in this, well, number one, reclaimed lumber has become a much hotter commodity. And so that becomes very expensive and also time consuming, to source. So we really didn't have the time to like be going all over, creation, trying to find, the perfect pieces of used wood, which I do love to do. I mean, there were some things that we found that were reclaimed. A lot of that was in the furniture. Lydia Marks, the set decorator, did an amazing job, and her team just finding like all these amazing objects to fill the space with. But I happen to be very fortunate to work with the best scenics in New York City, Elizabeth Lynn and her crew, and they are wizards at aging and patina. So all when you go into that back room of the Rabbit and you see all those exposed wood beams, on the ceiling, that was all
Yeah.
brand new lumber that they stained and
Wow.
chiseled and you know yeah, pretty much everything that you see in there, all the crumbling plaster, all that, that the brick, that brick is cardboard. It's called pulp art.
Wow. That's
It's
awesome.
basically a paper version of a vacuum form impression of brick that then a lot of steps go into, you have to, it comes brown and then you have to treat it, you fill in the pockets and then you add actual mortar to it and then you paint the brick, but that's just for flat brick. Then any of the brick that's dimensional, like in those archways, as if we broke through from one building to the
Yeah.
other, um, all of that was sculpted, out of foam and plaster. Um, what are some of the other things?
So cool.
Old hardware. Sometimes we buy new and then they add a patina to it. And then the other thing from the construction perspective, and some of this starts in the way it's drawn, and then some of it is just in the way it's built. Like you don't when you build something new, everything's plumb and even, but this is a house, or sorry, not a house, but this is a building that's, you know, hundreds of years old. It's settled over time. There are no right angles. So that all has to be, it's much easier to just like make things plumb.
Yeah.
But like, we would come up with like little tricks to like stick shims into things to throw them out of level, or like make the floorboards have gaps in them, all sorts of tricks like that. And
Wow.
yeah.
I mean, the question's so obvious when you're asking it for someone, for example, who's designing for ancient Egypt, for example. It's very clear that it looks really real, but we know it's not. On this, I have no idea. It looks so authentic. It looks like you just walked into
Great.
something called the Black Rabbit downtown, and everyone's great, and we just get on with our lives. And the fact that you all went to so much effort is so impressive to me. And it, it reminds me of this. Spaces reveal character before dialogue does. That's one of the
Yeah.
the main tenets. And you touched on this earlier about the brothers, but the Black Rabbit is where the brothers perform their public versions, particularly Jude Law's character. And then
Mm.
I'm just wondering, how did you think about their private spaces as places where the masks come off and we kind of see who they really are?
You mean out like in their apartments or Jude's
Yeah, in their
office?
apartments and just when, yeah, and exactly when they're not performing, especially Jude Law, when they're not performing, what kind of design elements were going into ensuring that we can kind of pick up on who these guys are before we start to get to know them through the story?
Well, you know, for Jake's apartment, Jude's character's apartment, we we thought it would be cool for him to live in Tribeca, um, because there are such like, big, fancy, but hip apartments down there.
Yeah,
And like, you know, we were trying to imagine like if you were going to entertain how would he want to? Because I don't look at him as actually having a private space. Maybe the closest thing to a private space is his office on the third floor of the Black Rabbit,
where he
but
sleeps.
where he sleeps. But his apartment is what he's trying to present to the people he dates, the company he entertains, even his ex-wife and his kid, right? Like he wants them to like kind of buy into a fiction that he's selling that isn't actually the truth. Um, and so we wanted something that really felt slick and almost felt like a little bit too good to be true. Um, so that's kind of where that came from. And then, I would say his office, a lot of conversation, when we're talking about designing the Black Rabbit and just talking about restaurants in general, about like what is the difference between front of house and back of house, and how, if a a restaurant in its own weird way functions like a movie set, right? It tells a story and it creates a mood. And when you're eating and dining in there, especially, a kind of a high-end place like the Black Rabbit is, like it's telling you a story. When you walk through that doorway, you might as well have been, traveling through the moors on a rainy
Yeah,
night, and you're coming in and find, uh, pulling up a stool to the bar and the innkeep's pouring you a pint, that kind of thing. So, so that, that's the story we're telling. Second, you go through those swinging doors into the kitchen, the light's brighter, it's chaotic, all of that chill is like gone. And then you go up that back staircase. It's a little bit kind of grody. And then you walk down the hallway on your way to the nightclub portion on the third floor, which is like the coolest space. But leading to that, you can stop over in Jake's office, which is like this cramped little thing that's sort of like it looks like it was two rooms in a tenement apartment that they cut out, and they probably were going to finish at one point, but they ran out of money. So it's just kind of like sitting there unfinished. And it's like the opposite of glamour. So to me, that was important to really to show that dichotomy, that like, once the lights come, and also this kind of happens in the scenes that take place in the main restaurant of the Black Rabbit during the day. When the
yeah,
daylight comes in, you see like the sticky residue on the surfaces of the bar, and things like that. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of
yeah.
some of the things we were
It's
thinking about.
fascinating,
And
that
something else
detail.
you touched on before, which I think is very astute, and it's something I think about a lot, is that you know, um, when you if you were like an architect or an interior designer and you're designing a restaurant like the Black Rabbit, you're designing for the future, right?
Yeah,
But you're designing for all the events that will happen, that have not happened yet. But when you design a set for a movie or a TV show, you're designing for the actions that are written in the script that will happen, but you're also designing for everything that has happened up until the story takes place, but hasn't been spoken, right? So like
yeah,
every cigarette that's been left burning too long that scorches the surface of the bar, every like ding or scuff on the floor or the wall, a dent in a wall where a fight might have broken out, like all those kinds of things. Each one you probably don't notice, but the cumulative effect of all of those little details, I think, does flesh out, an environment and makes it feel more authentic. And that's both for the viewer, but I think that's also for the cast and the filmmakers, right? If you can step through that threshold and and uh, uh, and kind of forget that you're in a sound stage, that just is going to help the storytelling. So we really work hard at trying to provide that as much as we can.
yeah. It's not just for the viewer, of course. The actors always say when the makeup goes on and the costumes go on, it really helps them get into character. Of course, it also helps them in the space that they are operating in. It's like you've created a portal for these people to really start to imagine where they are, and that of course informs their performance. You know, this designing functioning restaurant that you, sorry, this functioning restaurant that you designed and created has to stand up to scrutiny on camera. But obviously, as we've been talking about, this is a TV show; it's not reality. So, how do you balance aesthetic with utility on a set like this? Because the restaurant's got to feel operational with a kitchen, traffic flow, constant movement. But where do you draw the line between what genuinely needs to function and only what needs to work on camera?
Great question. So ultimately, like a movie set is a tool for telling the story, but it's a bespoke tool, and you know, each movie has its own requirements, or TV show has its own requirements for what that tool needs to do. So part of the function of that tool is the aesthetics and everything we've just been talking about, like what the visual storytelling is through the space and the choices you make in designing it. But then there's also the practical elements of like how how you can shoot within it. So, one of the things that we did on this, which this is kind of the first, now I do it all the time, but this was the first time where, typically you do some concept art so that, everybody can get on board with what the look is going to be. But usually that's like, a couple of views of, one or two rooms so that everyone kind of gets the boilerplate idea, and then you kind of
Mm,
riff off of that. But what we did on this is I used Chris Lang, who I'd worked with before, but who had kind of left the movie industry to sort of learn about virtual reality, and then came back and kind of applied some of the skills that he learned in that space to movie making. And so he, before the set was even done being built, he made a virtual model of it, complete with all the wallpapers that we had sourced and the furniture that Lydia had found, was able to light it using Unreal Engine and all of this stuff so that we could put the directors in the headset and they could walk around the space before they had even stepped foot in it. And that gave us the ability to make changes to the set before it was too late. So like, sometimes we needed a sight line from one area in the restaurant to another, but there was a piece of architecture blocking that. Well, we could make that adjustment, and we might not have found that out till it was too late. And either they would have had to work around it and change their shot, or we would have had to do a costly, amendment to the set. So having that tool to sort of like live in the space before it was done was hugely helpful. But like, I mean, other things to speak to your question is like, we had our food stylists also come from the restaurant world, and they functioned as our restaurant advisors, and they kind of taught us how it all works and like what the flow
mm,
is in the kitchen, and how the different workstations are broken down and stuff. And we had this idea that it would be the problem is like where you would maybe put certain workstations isn't the most cinematic thing, right? Because to see a
mm.
person cooking on the grill would probably be up against the wall. So that means either you're shooting the back of someone's head, or you have to create a unnatural like portal to put the camera, or cut a camera portal to put the camera in an
Yeah,
unnatural spot. Um, so one of the thoughts that we had was to make the walk-in refrigerator have a glass door to it, so that could be behind, that we put the grill and the stove on a central island and put that a glass door behind them so that they could grab ingredients through the glass door. But that also gave us depth. You always are looking for depth, right? Because that's what's photogenic. You never want to
mm,
shoot just into a flat wall. So that was like a little bit of an invention. I mean, I think you probably could find restaurants where something like that exists, but that was a little bit of an invention on our part to make it a little bit more visually interesting. But we worked with the advisors to make it still believable, and there was a little bit of
yeah.
back and forth. But anyway, we got to it.
I got to admit, I could listen to you talk about this stuff all day because I'm like, I don't know about you, but I'm such a restaurant nerd. Like, I walk into a restaurant, as you mentioned earlier, you walk in and you're ready for an experience, the fit out, the little touches, the service, the lighting, and the fact that you are able to recreate or create this space so authentically, and also think about camera movement and blocking. That's just an added layer of complication. And look what you were able to come up with. It's incredible, Alex. My final question is more about the series look and feel overall. We're not always in the restaurant space. We're outside and obviously in the finale on that horrifying ledge. So there's a noir undercurrent, I think, to this show. And when I spoke to Kate and Zach, that's something that we talked about at length. I'm just wondering, in production design terms, what does noir like mean to you in a modern New York setting?
Well, you know, like noir is all about the shadows, right? And so much. A lot of what we talked about when we were choosing the greater, locations, outside of the restaurant, is that we wanted to represent New York, but we didn't want to represent like the tourist version of New York. We wanted to represent a New Yorker's New York. Places or textures that, like, if you've lived there or you've spent any kind of meaningful amount of time there, would be immediately familiar to you. And one of the things that is so amazing about the city is that you could live there your entire life and you could find something that you've never noticed before tucked around a corner every single day. It's never, the city is never completely knowable. Um, so, you know, that was a big thing about trying to find I mean, even places that have been shot before that you've seen in shows, we were trying to,
Yeah,
I mean, look, the Black Rabbit, the 279 Water Street, I mean, it shows up in an episode of Kojak. It shows up in an episode of, or you see the exterior of it in The French Connection. Weirdly, a movie that my uncle, who's a film editor, edited called McBain with Christopher Walken. There's an establishing shot of it in that. And I didn't find that out till like a year after we were done with the show. But so so it's not even to say that these are places that you've never seen before, but they might be places you've never noticed before that you could have walked by a million times and you never really like clocked, and that just,
yeah.
just changing the focus a little bit sort of opens up a whole different version of the city. Our work in Chinatown, it was either in the finale episode or the second to last episode with the
Mm,
with the chase sequence through that Chinatown mall. That was one texture, and then also the juxtaposition of the different kinds. The high and low. Wes's apartment with those. The three sides of the apartment have the most breathtaking view you've ever
yeah.
seen. And then, like, what we already talked about, Jake's apartment, and then the pool room, the former Four Seasons, that he wants to take over. Just trying to, like, pepper in all of these different flavors that the city has to offer. That was important. I don't know if I really answered your noir question. I mean,
Did
I guess the
you,
most noiry thing that we did was like use that basement area at the Russian Turkish baths, which, we built the hideout, but the tunnel leading to the hideout is the real basement of the baths. And that was really cool to use. And
amazing.
that's a perfect example of something that, like, you could have been to the baths a million times in your life, but you never got down there because that's off limits to the public. So kind of opening those little portals into a city that you don't get to see was fun.
Well, listen, Alex, I love this show and I love your work on it. I know you're a two-time Emmy nominee. I hope this is going to be Emmy nomination number three. You so deserve it. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks for talking.